Good evening and welcome to Skeptics in the Pub Online. I'm Kat and I'm going to be your host for the evening. If this is your first time joining us at Skeptics in the Pub Online, first of all, welcome. And a little about us. We are a collaboration of various Skeptics in the Pub groups that got together during the pandemic when lockdowns meant that we couldn't have our regular meetings in pubs. So we came together to put on meetings over the internet, and we'd liked what we'd created so much that we decided to keep on going, even when we could carry on going back to the pub. The running order for tonight is we're going to have a talk from our wonderful guest speaker, and they will talk for about 45 to 60 minutes. After that, we'll have a 15-minute break, during which you can submit questions for our speaker, and then we'll have a Q&A session where we'll put your questions to our speaker. And this talk tonight is going to be a very special one because there'll be some interactive elements. So if you can grab some paper and a pen, then you can join in with the exercise that we'll be having throughout the talk. Tonight, we are joined by Adrienne Hill. She's a retired high school mathematics teacher and has been a volunteer educating teachers, students and community members about Tourette Syndrome and its comorbid disorders since 2005. She's a board member and educational consultant for the Tourette OCD Alberta Network. Her personal journey as a mother of 3 children includes 2 who have been diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. Beyond her involvement with the network, Adrienne actively contributes as a board member to Susan Gerbic's non-profit organisation About Time. She also volunteers as a Guerrilla Skeptic on Wikipedia editor and is a regular reporter for the Skeptic Zone podcast. Her written work has been featured in publications like the Skeptic Australia and the Skeptical Inquirer magazines. So please put your hands together and give a big virtual welcome to Adrienne Hill.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really, really exciting to be talking to the iconic Skeptics in the Pub from my home in Calgary, Alberta, where it's actually quite lovely right now. It's not too cold, which is unusual for this time of year. And just to reiterate what Kat just said, please make sure you do have paper and pencil, or paper, pen and pencil available. One sheet should be enough. We're going to do a little exercise at the end of my talk, so it won't be for a little while. And I like to just start off a little bit with my background, and Kat did an amazing job describing my background, but I thought we'd start off with something a little more fun. I did a much shortened version of this talk for the Monterey County Bay Skeptics in 2021. And this is what how she introduced me. She said that I am the galactic overlord of both time and space within the boundaries of Calgary, Canada. And I am the giver of talks on moose and the superiority of Canadian maple syrup versus Australian maple syrup. And I thought I would share that with you because I thought it was a lot of fun. And of course, then we have the real bio, which Kat went over very, very well. And the main thing I wanted to focus on right now, because it's relevant to the talk, is that I am actually a retired high school math, or as you would say, maths teacher. And because I'm a former teacher, and at the time when I became involved with Tourette syndrome, I was a teacher working in the classroom. So I contacted Tourette Canada, who offered a program to train people to go into the classroom and teach teachers how to deal with kids with Tourette syndrome, ADHD, and OCD, and other disorders. And they used really good sources. They used neurologists to vet everything, and they used psychologists and psychiatrists to vet the materials. And we would go into the classroom to help out teachers and students and also community members. And I did that from 2005 to 2018. Why did I stop in 2018? Essentially, Tourette Canada has had some issues. They've had some leadership changes and unfortunately have become a much smaller organization, and they don't do as much. So what happened in 2019 is Dr. Tamara Pringsheim set up the Tourette OCD Alberta Network here in Alberta. There were a number of reasons she did this, including Tourette Clinic in Edmonton, north of here, closing down. And so I reached out to her and said, hey, I'm no longer with Tourette Canada, and I've been working with her. I worked with Tamara, Dr. Pringsheim, when I was a volunteer for Tourette Canada as well. And here she is. This is our fearless leader. And Tourette syndrome, what is it and how is it diagnosed? And I'm going to go over more of what it is a little bit later. And to get a diagnosis, you have to have the presence of one or more motor tic, actually more than one motor tic, so two or more motor tics, and at least one vocal tic. And I'll discuss what those are in a little bit. And the frequency comes and goes, and the onset of these symptoms must be before age 18, otherwise it's most likely something else that's causing it. And it can't be another medical condition such as Parkinson's, brain trauma, etc. So how long has this been around? As far as I know, it's been documented way back. There have been documentations of people who have unusual tic-like behavior, but the very first person to write a paper about it was this guy here. He was a French physician named Gilles de la Tourette, and he lived from 1857 to 1904. And most of his writings, believably, I guess, were about mesmerism or hypnotism, the early days of mesmerism, and hysteria. But in 1885, he published an account of 9 patients that he had that he called convulsive tic disorders. And so that's what the disorder became named. So it's named after this fellow. And what are tics? Well, I have to read this one out because it's quite complicated because it says semi-voluntary. They're not involuntary because it's a little bit subtle. Tics are described as semi-voluntary because they are experienced as a voluntary response to an unwanted or premonitory urge. And it's a very unique aspect of tics versus other movement disorders. And the tics are suppressible but irresistible, very, very difficult to not give in to the urge. And a good way of describing this is if you have an armful of mosquito bites and you want to itch so badly, and you can stop yourself from itching, but it can be very, very difficult. So this is what it's like for people to have a tic. However, sometimes the tics come on, the urge is so short that it comes on so quickly, it can be very, very difficult to stop them. And young children have a very difficult time stopping these tics. So one of the big myths that happens is that people think with Tourette syndrome, it stays the same all the time. What makes this disorder very complicated is that they're constantly changing how they sound, how they appear. Sometimes they seem to go away and then they come back and they're stronger than ever. They never stay the same. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The tics are very repetitive. I had a friend, Steve. He's used to present with me when I was with Tourette Canada, a wonderful fellow, really great presenter. And he actually said, ba, 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 for several days over and over and over again. And they don't like it. People around him go crazy. It can be very difficult for people around people with Tourette syndrome as well as the person themselves. It could be very, very difficult. And I think this is a really big one, as I would go into schools all the time or community centers, and the employees or the teachers would say to me, oh, yeah, we had an employee 5 years ago with Tourette syndrome. It was fine. No issues. However, every person is so different. I have 3 children. All 3 actually could have been diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. It is a spectrum disorder. My middle boy, he has very mild tics and presented very mildly, did really well in school, really needed very little intervention until actually he went to get his PhD, and then he needed to get some accommodations at that time. And that's another thing I always tell parents is that accommodations are available, at least in North America, all through school, as long as you have the documentation. But we never got a formal diagnosis of Tourette syndrome for him because his tics were so mild. It was more some of the other things that I'm going to talk about later that were more of an issue for him. My youngest and oldest have what's called Tourette Syndrome Plus, and I'll define what that is coming up. And between all three of them, the only tic that I can think of off the top of my head that they had in common was an eye tic, which is the most common tic you can have. All the other tics were completely different from one another. They come and go, as I talked about, in complexity and severity. And remember that one when we talk about alternative therapies later on, that they wax and wane, they come and they go. So the other thing is that you must have both the motor and the sound tics to have Tourette syndrome. I mentioned that before, but I want to reiterate that. There's lots of other tic disorders out there, and this is just, we call it the granddaddy of tic disorders. So first of all, let's start off defining the most simple ones. And these are the ones that usually show up first. They involve one muscle group, and it can be unusual blinking, squinting, widening the eyes. So when I say blinking, I have a little bit of that right now where I blink a little more frequently than I need to. Part of it is because we live in Calgary and it's very, very dry here. So I have a tendency to blink a little more than usual, but squinting like this and then opening your eyes over very rapidly. And they're usually darting and very meaningless. Remember that word, almost all tics are meaningless all the time. Sometimes they can be purposeful, and it's hard to parse it out, but they're not meaningful at all. So a simple motor tic, some more examples: nose wrinkling, shrugging, rapid jerking of any part of the body. In essence, a tic can actually be any movement. The sky's the limit for what is called a tic. Abdominal tensing, so things that are hidden, can also be simple motor tics. Scrunching up the feet, so you may not even know they're ticking because they're hidden, but they can be very draining. So let's go on to complex motor tics. Complex motor tics are much longer in duration, and they involve multiple muscle groups, just like it sounds. My eldest son had what we called the shiver tic, and we've all experienced, when we go into a cold room, we can shiver. Well, he would start with that little bit of a shiver, and then his whole body would convulse, and the very end of that tic was a sudden hand out. And we learned fairly early on, when he developed this tic, to make sure we weren't standing to the right side of him, because that arm was going to go out and we could get hit. He also attempted to move so he wouldn't hit somebody, but he wasn't always able to do that because it would come on so quickly, but he would do his best. So then we go on to what we call a vocal tic. Now, a vocal tic is anything that comes from the mouth. So it doesn't have to be words, which is one of the myths, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So we can have coughing, throat clearing, like that, and sniffing. That can be a tic. Grunting, whistling, barking like a dog. I've heard that one from a lot of adults and kids. Screeching. Now, Graham had one that was very high-pitched, like that, and gurgling. Lots of different ones. That's just a very short list. And then we go to the complex tics. Now, these ones, and remember I said that the movements are out of context? These are also out of context. And they're words and phrases that can make sense and may sometimes kind of make sense. And here's some examples of ones, shut up, that I've heard other people have. Shut up. And you notice how I'm saying shut up in the middle of my sentence and it doesn't really make sense. However, remember I said sometimes it could have meaning, because if that's their tic and they're mad and you're saying something to them that they're not happy about, they're probably going to say shut up when it becomes both a tic and it's meaningful as well. So it can be tricky to parse it apart. That top one, I love chocolate milk. My youngest would say that all the time. Would run up to his friends at the playground and then say, I love chocolate milk. Hey, let's go play tag. And it doesn't really make sense, but it's a full sentence that makes sense. It just doesn't make sense in the context. My oldest would always say, what's for dinner tonight? And tics can be situational, so they don't have to always be about just randomness. So this one was just specially for me, nobody else. Get up in the morning, he would see me, he'd say, hey, Mom, what's for dinner tonight? Come back to after school, look at me, hey, Mom, what's for dinner tonight? Serve him dinner, hey, Mom, what's for dinner tonight? After dinner, he would see me, hey, Mom, what's for dinner tonight? You can see how it loses its context. Now, this is the one that everybody usually wants to talk about. And I'm going to ask you, I want you to think about this. Approximately what percentage of people with Tourette syndrome actually have the swearing tic? This is the one you see on Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Phil, and quite often online. The people with Tourette syndrome that show their videos, they have this particular tic. And I just want to tell a little story about one of the students that I went into the classroom for many years ago, and just a perspective that changes when you have Tourette syndrome. This little girl that I was asked to go in the classroom for because she was being bullied, had a spitting tic. Now, that's a vocal tic. We call that because it comes from the mouth. She had a spitting tic, and I've known several students who have had this tic. Could you imagine how horrifying this is for the kid as well as everybody around them? And one of the kids that I know about actually had to spit on someone, and there were some very creative ways they got around that, and very successfully. But it was horrifying. And so that tic, like I said, they come and they go. You never know how long they're going to stay. This one went away and was replaced with the swearing tic. And the teachers, the kids, and the mother and the kid were all, phew, oh, I'm so glad that one's gone away. Now I just swear in class. And they were very happy about that. So what percentage of people with Tourette syndrome have it? It's less than 10%. They usually give the range of between 7 and 10% at any time that will have this. So very few people, all three of my kids, never have this one. I'm grateful for that. Does it mean it won't happen? No, it could happen later on. We just don't know. And what is it called when we have this swearing tic? It's called coprolalia. And what this lady's doing here, that's another tic, that's a motor tic. If you do obscene gestures, it's called copopraxia. So now what makes tics worse? Well, good stress, bad stress, and illness. So if you're going to go on a holiday and you're getting excited about going on that holiday, the tics will increase. If you have a work presentation the next day, during, probably before, maybe even during, the tics could get worse. And a big one for my family, besides those, was illness. And illness was really problematic. And because what happens, if you have a cold, for example, we cough. Most people, the cold goes away, the cough goes away. But with someone with Tourette syndrome, there's a good likelihood that the cough will persist. So they keep coughing and they keep coughing. And they go to the doctor, and it's often misdiagnosed as asthma. So it's really important to get a proper diagnosis, obviously. Is this Tourette syndrome, or is this an actual medical illness that needs medication? And the worst one that my oldest had was a vomiting tic. He ended up with a virus where he coughed so violently that he vomited. And that virus went away, and he would cough and vomit, cough and vomit. And this went on for 4 months. And we ruled out all other possibilities. We ruled out, is this acid reflux? Does he have something wrong with his digestive system? He went through so many tests. Everything was ruled out. And then I phoned the Tourette clinic and said, is it possible this is a tic? And they're like, oh, yeah, absolutely. So then the treatment changed to something called cognitive behavioral intervention for tics, or more in the case of my psychologists or our psychologists that we used, more of an exposure and response type therapy, and it worked. So those are dangerous. We need to change them, but we can't change them all, obviously, because they're just going to be replaced by another one. But we can get rid of some of those with a lot of work, and it's hard. It's really, really hard. So another thing that makes tics worse is just seeing or hearing somebody tic, and we're going to talk a little more about that a little later when we get into the TikTok tics. So just remember that, seeing them, mimicking. Think about yawning. You know, when we yawn, everybody in the room wants to start yawning. It's kind of like that, but with Tourette syndrome, it's just that much worse. and talking about ticks. I used to say to my kids, hey, I haven't seen that terrible tick you hated for a while. And they go, shush, Mom, be quiet, because I now feel like I need to do that tick again. So talking about them or seeing someone can make them worse. What helps? Well, same thing that helps everybody keep healthy. Get enough sleep. Can you imagine? My oldest one had a sleep disorder, partly because his tics were quite severe. He couldn't get to sleep. So you have this vicious cycle where the tics are bad, they can't sleep, therefore their tics get worse. And so sleep is really important. Exercise is really good. And one of the really cool things about they can get relief by doing something they really love that requires intense concentration. So a lot of kids with Tourette syndrome will say play hockey, they'll play the drums. That's a really popular one. My son, my oldest, played classical guitar. And when playing classical guitar, doesn't tick at all, just absolutely fine. It's wonderful to see. So, can they suppress? I've talked a little bit about this. Yes, just like you can stop scratching an itch, you can hold your breath for a time, you can stop, but usually it has to come out, especially with young children. Adults get better at it. They can suppress to some degree, but there is a real toll when you do this. Just imagine holding your breath and being told to finish your work at work or finishing a test at school. You're going to be concentrating on holding your breath. You're not going to be concentrating on doing your work. So that's the problem. And the other problem is especially when multiple tics are involved, it can make the other tics come out more. My oldest had a very high-pitched squeal, which I can't even replicate. It's very hard to replicate. And he wanted to go to this movie so badly. And we said, yeah, we can go, but you can't do that tick. That's going to drive everybody crazy in the theater. So you need to hold that back. He was a little bit older. And he said, yeah, I'm willing to do that. But his facial tics and his leg tics and his arm tics went crazy as he was doing it. But he was quiet. It was wonderful. He was able to enjoy the movie, sort of. He probably had to concentrate an awful lot. And I just want to go over that Tourette syndrome is not a learned behavior. It's not a result of bad parenting. It's not curable. There's no cure that we know of. And it's certainly not an intentional choice. I think the most frustrating thing that I encountered going into communities and schools was teachers, administrators, parents, etc., would say, well, this is an intentional choice. They just want to do this for attention. And I could say the same thing for ADHD. Oh, they're just seeking attention. And that is not the case. Most of these kids are horrified and embarrassed, especially when they hit puberty. They really want to hide this. So I think it's a disservice to say that it's an intentional choice. It really is not. And I don't think most of you probably would not either. This is going back 20 years when people didn't know as much about this stuff. So things have certainly gotten a lot better. And also, it's not the only tic disorder. The basic simplest one is called transient tic disorder, and there's a lot of kids that will get this. About 20% of kids, students, will have a tic somewhere while they're developing and growing up. And then it comes for 6 months, a year, maybe a year and a half, and it's one tic, and it goes away, never comes back. So that's a transient tic disorder, and there's lots of other ones in between transient tic and Tourette syndrome. As I say, Tourette syndrome is sort of the granddaddy of them all. So I talked about what is TS plus, and that's what my kids were diagnosed with. And what this means is that they have multiple other associated disorders. Most youth who actually get a diagnosis of Tourette syndrome don't just have tics. And I think that's partly because when you add in the other disorders, there's issues that are really problematic to daily living, and therefore they seek help. Whereas if it's just tics and they're not too bad, you're not going to necessarily go to the doctor. So here is the list of some of the comorbid disorders that go along with Tourette syndrome. And apparently 90% of patients seen in specialized patient clinics do have comorbidities. And the most common, there's two of them that are the most common, and that's obsessive compulsive disorder and ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But there's elevated rates of sleep disorders, learning disabilities, self-injurious behaviors, which my youngest had, which is very scary, mood disorders, generalized anxiety, all three of my kids have that one, etc. in this population. In fact, all of three of them have obsessive compulsive symptoms, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. So we're going to just look briefly at OCD and ADHD. This is another 2-hour talk, just to add those two in. And please do feel free to ask me questions about OCD and ADHD afterwards, because I've spent years helping people with both of them. All three of my kids have been diagnosed with ADHD, and all three of them had obsessive compulsive symptoms, which is still can be very debilitating, but doesn't quite fit the diagnostic criteria for the DSM-5 for obsessive compulsive disorder. So what's interesting is 60% of youth who are diagnosed with Tourette syndrome also have ADHD. And 38% are diagnosed with OCD. However, 90% are diagnosed with obsessive compulsive symptoms. And I think, you think about that. Look at the overlap. My kids have all three. So that's pretty typical based on the numbers. So now I'm going to go back to Tourette syndrome. What is the occurrence? Some of you may recognize this fellow. He's a hero of mine. This is Dr. Oliver Sacks. He's a neurologist. And he, in his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, he said that in 1971, when he had his first patient, there was an incidence of 1 in a million people. And he said to himself, is it possible that Tourette's is very common but fails to be recognized, but once recognized is easily and constantly seen? And I think that's so true. You jump ahead to now from 1971, and I think that's what happened. It's like autism, any of these other disorders that were rare before and are no longer rare. It's just because we have better diagnostic testing and we recognize it and we know about it. So what's the occurrence? It's about 1% of, sorry, I'm going to turn that off. That's my fan, getting old. Approximately 1% of school-age children. And I'm using school-age because it tends to go down into adulthood. So it's 3 times more likely in boys than girls, but boys and girls have the same symptoms. There's no difference in diagnostic criteria. Tends to peak during adolescence, so puberty. Going into 10 to 12, as you head into that puberty, things are awful. Trust me, it was very difficult for my kids. And I will say for the schools and for me as a parent and my husband, it was challenging. And there's luckily a high improvement rate in late adolescence and going into early adulthood, so early 20s. And as I say, it can continue into adulthood. And what I've been told and what I've read in the literature is it's approximately 1/3 who have less tics afterwards, and it can decrease to nothing. And that's after puberty. 1/3, they stay the same. So it goes up at puberty and then goes back to sort of the pre-puberty levels. And then 1/3, their tics increase. And my friend Steve Call that I had talked about earlier, that's one of his symptoms is he's gotten older, they progressively have gotten worse and worse to the point he no longer can work. They're so bad. It's very sad. He's such a talented man. So I'm going to ask you guys a question just to make sure you guys are paying attention so you can think about this. At what age does Tourette syndrome typically manifest? When does it start? When do you first start seeing it? So this is an average, so age 2 to 5, 6 to 8, 10 to 12, or age 15 to 18. Well, the answer is B. It's usually between the ages of 6 to 8. So you're not born with tics. You just don't start ticking as soon as you're born. They don't manifest until later. My kids, both my oldest and youngest, my oldest was around 4, and when he started ticking with the eye blinks, and he had some neck ticks early on. And my youngest was probably around 5 or 6, so more in that average range. And my middle boy was about 8 or 9 when the ticks started, and they were very mild, and they stayed with him. And I have another question for you. This is just to look at, there are some famous people out there with Tourette syndrome. And I want to know which one of these people has admitted to having a diagnosis of Tourette syndrome. So we've got Emma Watson, Seth Rogen, Ryan Reynolds, and Gwyneth Paltrow. We've got a couple Canadians in there. And it is Seth Rogen. He came out in 2021 saying that he had Tourette syndrome, and he is a Canadian actor. That's why I picked him, because he's Canadian, and he's a comedian, and he's also a filmmaker. And you can check him out on Wikipedia, because I'm a Wikipedia editor, if you want to find out more about him. So there's also, of course, Billie Eilish, who is the singer, and she has Tourette syndrome. She came out and admitted that when she was around 18 years of age, when it was noticed she was ticking when she was off camera. So my last question for you, and I'm asking this because it's about Calgary, and a lot of people don't know a lot about Calgary, and here's a little piece of information that you can learn. So in Calgary, this is some research that was done by Dr. Tamara Pringsheim, who's head of the Tourette OCD Alberta Network. She's also in charge of the Tourette Clinic here at the University of Calgary and the Children's Hospital. And so she said that people diagnosed with Tourette syndrome or obsessive compulsive disorder. So that means people with just OCD, people with just Tourette syndrome or just tics, and people who have both. So combining all of those people, if you look at that, are there more people? There are more people than those diagnosed with autism. There are more people than those diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. 4% of the population of Calgary, over 50,000 people in Calgary, all of the above or none of the above. And I'm guessing you guys are going to guess correctly with this one. It is indeed all of the above. So we have over 50,000 people in our city alone that have these diagnoses. It's a lot more common than we would know. And what's really interesting, I think, with this is that I've often been asked when I've been traveling, oh, Calgary, I know Calgary. Yeah, how big is that? Is that like 300,000 people? And no, it's actually 1.3 million people. And that's why 4% is over 50,000 people. So we're a fairly good sized city, not like London. London is much bigger than what we are, but we're not a small city. So let's go into this trend you've probably heard about. And there's been some videos done about it and some discussions. And this was actually studied by Dr. Tamara Pringsheim and Dr. Davida Martina. And he wrote a great book that I use as a resource. So there was an interesting thing that happened during the pandemic, and it was called the TikTok tics with teens. And it was big news for quite a while. So let's take a look at it. So what happened in 2020 is all of a sudden at the Tourette Clinic here at Alberta Children's Hospital, there was a different kind of patient that suddenly started coming in for treatment. The clinic was seeing patients with quite a different presentation of tics. And remember and we're going to go compare these more coming up, but just remember the age of onset that I talked about before that was in the quiz. So these were mostly girls, young women between the ages of 12 and 25. And they had developed tics very rapidly. And the patients seemed to have no previous history of tics, at least most of them. And the impairment for these girls was severe, and they were unable to go to work. They were unable to go to school. And this trend did continue through the pandemic. Because I always forget, the reason I need my notes for this next one is I always forget the name of some of these terms. I have, with ADHD, I have it. And one of the things with ADHD is forgetting things, forgetting details. And as I'm getting older, it's not getting any better. So essentially what was happening is that these tics were probably not Tourette syndrome and were viewed as rapid onset tics. And they were called functional tic-like behaviors. And that's sort of a big term. And it's a subset of what would be called a functional neurological disorder, or FND, which indicates symptoms are incompatible with a recognized neurological or medical condition. These types of mimicking are actually quite well known and well documented. There is a history before the pandemic of cases of people showing up at emergency rooms with seizure symptoms, like what they've seen in TV and movies. And they're not like real seizures. But upon testing, they were found not to have actual seizures, but they had seen this and something was triggered in their brains, and they're real, they're actually experiencing this, but you can't diagnose them. Could you imagine treating somebody with this with seizure medication when it's actually this functional neurological disorder? The treatment's very different. You don't medicate. You use something like cognitive behavioral therapy. There's therapies to help. Very different from if it was real seizures. The same thing can be said regarding these tics that were coming in. It's these tic-like behaviors were one of these functional neurological disorders. That's what they think is happening. And they're still studying it at the university. So they're still trying to come up with what's going on with that. So let's take a look briefly at the differences between Tourette syndrome and these functional tic-like behaviors. So as discussed already, tics develop usually slowly over time. They start with one, usually the eye blinks, but it can be other things as well, but usually, and they get increase in severity as you age into puberty, and then they usually improve in later teens. And now let's compare this with the rapid onset tics. So we're going to notice later on stages, as I said, between 12 and 24, there are, and the other thing that's really interesting is that there's a lot of commonalities between the cases. Neurologists around the world started talking and they were finding, hey, they've got the same tics. Whereas Tourette syndrome, as I said, that doesn't happen. It's so rare. And there was a quick progression from simple tics to complex tics, and it was usually over just a week, sometimes a few hours. So you can imagine how frightening this was for these young women and their families. And the vocal tics were often the same. They were saying beans, beans, and woohoo, knock, knock, and such things, whistling, making a clicking sound. There was a lot of coprolalia, or swearing, that was involved. And remember, only 10% of people with Tourette syndrome have coprolalia, versus most of these cases with sudden onset tics showed this feature. So about 70% reported no previous tics, which is also very interesting. And I think that what they really honed in on was that most of these cases had a previous diagnosis of anxiety and depression. And it was, of course, simultaneously in all countries, not all countries, but in countries around the world, at least those are the ones that reported it. I'm sure it was in more countries than Canada, the UK, Australia, Germany, and the US, but those are the documented ones. So one of the findings, and this actually came about because of Dr. Pringsheim's daughter, they were trying to figure out where these tics were coming from. There obviously was something happening. So they were checking YouTube and they were checking Facebook. And the daughter said, hey, have you checked out TikTok? So they checked out TikTok, and sure enough, they actually found some videos with these specific tics that were happening and that they were mimicking. And so I think they kind of found it. What the problem was, these people were watching them and mimicking them, and their brains were saying, hey, let's copy this. And here's the one that they feel probably is where this started, where a lot of them, because this girl said beans, and I love her name. Her name is Trippy Hippie, and she is an English woman with Tourette syndrome. She actually has 16 million followers the last time I checked, which was about a month ago. And that's 16 million followers on TikTok and hundreds of thousands on both Instagram and YouTube. And here's a question. Do we need to panic? And I did see some videos out there saying, this is happening. We need to take our phones away from our kids because we're going to have all these people all over the world with Tourette syndrome or tick-like behaviors, so we need to just get rid of all this. Do we need to panic about this? And I would say no. This is a very small percentage of girls worldwide that this actually happened to. Remember, Tourette syndrome is 1% of youth. This would be smaller. Now, for those who are susceptible to this, that's one of the first line treatments is no more TikTok, no more YouTube, or at least not watching things like TikTok, or not TikTok, Tourette videos. That is not going to be good. What do we know? We know we need to get a proper diagnosis. That's really, really important, like I talked about already with regards to the seizures, same thing. We also know that echoing behavior is extremely common and with humanity, and is obviously worse with people with Tourette syndrome and obviously worse with people with dysfunctional disorder. And we also have to think this could have been an undiagnosed Tourette syndrome because the tics can be quite subtle, such as abdominal tensing, such as scrunching your toes. They can be very, very subtle. They don't have to be out there. So it could have been undiagnosed Tourette syndrome. And I think they have actually found a few cases of that. So it does make sense that all of a sudden they're worse because they've gone through puberty and they're one of those cases that gets worse after they go through puberty. So that is still a possibility. But we also know it could be this functional neurological disorder. So it's important to parse it out again because of the treatment plans. So should TikTok be blamed? I've already said no. Because here's an additional reason. It could have easily have been movies if it wasn't TikTok, especially during the pandemic when there was so much stress and there was lots of people on watching movies, watching social media, etc. But remember, meeting people with Tourette syndrome could have also done this as well. Obviously, the numbers wouldn't be as large because there's not as much access to people with Tourette syndrome. So these things can also cause the same thing. Now, I'd like to get into the CAM treatments. And this one really bothers me because I've had over the years desperate parents that so want to help their kids. They just, I mean, it is heartbreaking when you have a kid that is struggling in school, socially, just in life in general, just day to day. It's very, very distressing as a parent. And so the most common thing that I was asked by parents is, have you tried this? Does it work? And here's the first one that was the most common. And these are called Tick Tamer, and they can be purchased on Amazon right now. It can be yours. Now, this is obviously North American, but I'm sure you can get it over in the UK for $50 US, including shipping. And it is homeopathic, so it will do nothing. But remember how I said that ticks wax and wane. So we could give the drops to the kid. Ticks get better on their own because it happens to coincide with that waxing and waning. Well, the drops worked. And then we forget when we get a new tick, oh, we'll just give the drops again. And then, oh, it worked. And so they're spending a lot of money on water, essentially. I did a quick Google just to find out about cures for Tourette syndrome, and this one popped up. And, top 5 homeopathic medicines for Tourette syndrome. And this is an MD, medical doctor, and he recommends these particular homeopathic remedies. And I'm not going to show you all of them. You can look them up for yourself if you want, but I just want to focus on a particular statement. And it's this statement right here. And it says, it is a homeopathic treatment for twitching and is recommended to cure tics in kids who are hyperactive and clumsy without fear of danger. There is no cure for Tourette syndrome. So I'm horrified that they are actually saying this on their website. And of course, there's a disclaimer at the bottom saying don't take this as medical advice. Now, this thing I have seen for many years online, and it is called the silencer, like how they spell it, SYLENCER, for outbursts. And I would actually call it a muzzle, especially with that little head strap that they have that you can put it on. And I was hoping it would no longer be on the market, but it is. But there is some good news because Amazon took it off. The comments under this were quite scathing, and I was happy to see that. And there were a couple of people saying, "Oh, you're being too harsh on it. It actually worked." And I'm like, okay, well, maybe. Admittedly, it is a possible helpful strategy if the kid wanted to carry this thing around, and if they had the urge to verbally tick and it was really embarrassing for them, he could put it over his mouth. But how about a hand or a hat or a sleeve? We could do that too, instead of making it look like a torture device. I don't understand this one, and it's not cheap. $109 for the two if you want to strap it on. So I decided to do a little look into what's going on in the UK, and I came across this fellow, and his name is Darren Daz, and he wears a lot of hats. He is a mental health coach, an awakening guide, an energy worker, a product designer, an entrepreneur, a DJ, a digital nomad, which is interesting, and a psychonaut. And I didn't know what that was, so I had to look that up. And apparently, what it means is he puts himself into an altered state. I wonder how he does that. Could be meditation, could be something else. He claims that he cured himself of a tic that he had for 20 years. And I watched a video of his, and it sounds like he says in his writings that he cured himself of a tic. In his video, it sounds like he had multiple tics, and they were quite severe. And he had them for 20 years without a doctor, and without a doctor's help and without medicine. He cured his condition naturally, and he can now share his wisdom with you. Is he a trained psychologist or doctor? I could find no evidence of any legitimate credentials other than he read a lot. He was cured by the age of 20. Now, remember how I said that tics can disappear after adolescence? I can't obviously say that's what happened here, but it is a possibility. So, this is what he says. I watched this video, and right on the video, he declares that Tourette syndrome can be cured in 90 days or less. Boy, if that was the case, I think Dr. Pringsheim would be using this treatment for sure. And he continues to say that especially, this is quote, especially if you don't want to take pills and you don't want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on frickin' therapists, okay, end quote. I want you to remember that bit about saving money, because while he does have a free video you can watch if you give him your contact info, no thank you, he offers this course, and it involves a lot of videos. There's a lot of paper, apparently. There's handouts. You can email him, all that kind of stuff. Well, how much does that cost? It's not too bad. You can get all that and learn at your own pace, watch a lot of videos for $174 US. Well, that's a lot of Canadian money, because our Canadian dollar is not worth anything. But apparently, this is a real deal, a big deal, because while perusing the motorticmastery.com page of his, I found this. I found that it used to be $595. And not only that, but if watching the videos just isn't enough, you can get 8 sessions with him for the low price of $1,249. The thing I think that disturbed me the most about this, and I'll get into the money in a minute, but the thing that really bothered me was this next thing, which he talks about cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, this is a legitimate therapy, but it has been co-opted, as happens so often, by the wellness industry. And it usually just means, let's just think positive thoughts and then great things will happen to you. And that's not what cognitive behavioral therapy is. My kids have gone through it, I've gone through it, and it is not that. It's actually work. And as just to note, In Canada, for $1,249 US, you can get 8 sessions with a registered psychologist who specializes in Tourette syndrome, OCD, ADHD, other disorders, uses exposure and response, which is what my kids went through. It was highly effective. Cognitive behavioral therapy, the CIBT that I talked about before, the comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics, and a large portion is often covered by healthcare here. I don't know about in the UK, but here it is. So it seems he doesn't want you to spend thousands and thousands on frickin' therapists, but instead pay him for the same number of therapy sessions. So that is my talk. I think I talked too fast. I apologize. I do talk very, very, very quickly. So what we're going to do now, I want you to get your pen and paper ready. And here is my dog, Jewel. I understand one of the big questions everybody always asks is, do you have a pet? And yes, I do. And this is Jewel, and she's going to watch you to make sure that you're doing this empathy exercise. Just imagine her, overlooking you and watching to make sure, because whenever I do this in person, I've done this many, many years in person, there's always somebody that tries to get away with something. So don't be that person, because you'll really miss out on what this is going to do. The other thing that's really interesting to me, Kat informed me that there are people that think it's really cool to have Tourette syndrome, and they want to have it because it's cool. And I'm thinking after this exercise, you're going to see that while I don't want to say you can't accomplish something, yes, you can. You can accomplish a lot despite having this disorder. It's not easy and it's difficult. And I want us to recognize how difficult it is for these kids and these adults. And just to give you an idea of how successful people can be, and this is where I think that this is a team effort. So my kids have done exceptionally well. And sorry, my phone just went off. So my kids have done exceptionally well. And I've got, between the three of them, there's one PhD in electrical engineering, there is a master's degree in civil engineering, a diploma in data science, a diploma in computer IT. Two of my kids own their homes, and that's not the guy with the PhD, just finished his PhD, he's still trying to earn money. And two are married. And I think that's successful. None of them live at home. They're all adults. They are functioning members of society, contributing members of society. They're great people, in my opinion. I know I'm biased. I get that. And how did they get there? Well, we had psychiatrists, neurologists, psychologists, occupational therapists, teachers, principals. It was a group effort. We all worked together to help my kids be successful. So let's do an empathy exercise so you can have a slight window into what it was they went through. So get your pens and pencils ready. And here are the instructions. I'm going to show the next slide. It won't have Jewel there. It's going to have another picture. And it's going to have a poem on it. It's actually a fun poem that I really like. And when I say on your mark, get set, go, you're going to start writing as fast as you can, and you're going to copy down as many words as neatly as you can, because you're going to hand it in for marks. We're going to go back to our school days. And I'm going to give you only 30 seconds, but I'm also going to give you Tourette syndrome. And I am going to be your brain. So when I clap, you're going to do a very specific tick. I'm going to give you a tick my friend Steve has, or had. He may not have it now. And that is, when I clap, you're going to rapidly punch. Let's see if I can do it in the screen here. Punch in the air with the pen that you're writing with. So if you're right-handed, you punch in the air with your right hand. If you're left-handed, you punch in the air with your left hand. So you're going to have 30 seconds. I'm going to go on your mark, get set, go. You're going to write as quickly as you possibly can the poem that I'm going to show in a second. When I clap, you do the tick. And I don't want, he's always saying, don't do this wimpy thing. Okay, don't do that. You got to punch it in the air, because remember, most ticks, not all, but most ticks are sudden and rapid. All right, hopefully you have no questions, because I can't see if you do. Okay, So here's the poem. It's Lewis Carroll. Hopefully you can see it. You could always blow it up and you're probably not going to get to the second paragraph. Some people do. That's why I put it there. But most people just get to the first. So if you need to blow up just that part, that first part, that's probably good. All right. On your mark, get set, go. 30 seconds. Ten seconds. And time. So a couple things that I want you to notice is that when I announced 10 seconds, the tics increased. And what I'm doing there is I am doing the anxiety bit where the tics increase. One of the biggest criticisms, or not criticisms, questions that have been asked about when we do this exercise, and I want you to think about this going forward, is people will say to me, that's not real. People don't tic that much. Remember I said that my kids have obsessive compulsive symptoms? Well, my oldest decided to chart and time for several days during the summer how often he tics, and he charted them. And he, on average, ticked every 3 seconds. And what I did is I gave you a tick every 5, or actually 10 seconds in this case. And so it was much less than what he would experience. And the end, when I clapped really quickly, that can happen. Bursts of tics over and over again, especially when there's anxiety involved. The other thing that I often get, a statement or a question, but don't they get used to it, and don't they overcome this because they find strategies and they can move forward? Yes, they absolutely can. However, don't forget that when you have Tourette syndrome, the tic you just got used to, you've got strategies, things are going well, goes away, and a new one comes in, and you have to start all over again. We used to call Graham, my oldest, my 3-week on, 3-week off. We would get 3 weeks, and then just towards the end of that 3 weeks, we've got it. And then things would change. And now we have to start all over again, and we're having the behavior issues, and we're having everything else that's really problematic. So yes, that is true. They can overcome. And as of course, if they're lucky enough to be the ones where it diminishes after puberty, things are pretty good. Okay, let's go again. We're going to now go on to round 2. So we're going to do 3 rounds. We're going to start over. So draw a line, tally up how many words you had there, count them up, put a circle around it, put a line under where you're at, and we're going to start over. And you're going to copy the poem again, same poem. But remember I said there's 60%, around 60% of people with Tourette syndrome that also have ADHD. So what's going to happen? You're still going to have your tic. I'm going to clap. You're going to punch. And then you're going to do something. You're going to have ADHD. And I'm going to go buzz, buzz like a bee. And you're going to become, instead of hyper-focused on the empathy exercise, you're going to become hyper-focused on the bee. That's one of the things that is a misconception about, or misperception about ADHD, is that it is a lack of focus. Unfortunately, what it is you're hyper-focused on many things. You can easily become hyper-focused on lots of different things. So you're going to become hyper-focused. So you're going to look up when I buzz. So bzz, you're going to look up, clap, you're going to punch. On your mark, get set, go. Bzz, bzz, bzz. 15 seconds. Bzz, bzz. Bzz. Time. All right, I want you to think about, again, write down the number of words you have there, and think about some of the feelings you had, how many words you got. I want you to really think about it, and we're going to go on to round 3. So the last thing, remember, many kids and adults have all 3, including my oldest and youngest: Tourette Syndrome, ADHD, and obsessive compulsive disorder. So we're going to do the same thing. Draw a line. We're going to start over. You're going to copy the same poem. And when I clap, you tick. When I buzz, you look up. And now I have this obsession with the number 3. And I actually had a student that I went into the classroom with, and he had a 3 obsession. And so he counted every third word. Now he erased it. We're not going to erase it. You're just going to cross it out exactly 3 times and then rewrite it. So whatever the word is, 1, 2, 3, you count it, you cross it off 3 times, rewrite. Plus all the other stuff. The clap is a tick, and the B is distracting you. And again, you're only going to have 30 seconds. Hopefully everybody's ready. Here we go. Ready, set, go. Zzz. Bzz, bzz. 15 seconds. Bzz, 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 bzz. Time. So I hope you have a good sense after that of what it's like to live with Tourette syndrome. And I have a big favor to ask of you. So what I'd like you to do is in the chat, and I'll go and look at the chat during the break, I want you to just sort of type in how you felt. Like, did anybody actually increase the number of words between round 1, round 2, and round 3? Now, it's probably unlikely because I did have a longer round 1. However, I have had in the past some people who have actually improved in round 2 when I added the distraction. I'm thinking we know what might be a possible diagnosis, because people with ADHD become very good at hyper-focusing and being able to change back and forth. Most people struggle with that. So occasionally I would get people who would do better in round 2 than in round 1, because they were warmed up, they got going. But I don't think that'll happen here. But if it did happen, I'd be very interested to hear. I want to know if there's anybody who actually didn't get any words by the last one. And we're also going to discuss a little bit of some of the feelings that you had, and I'm hoping some of them will show up in the chat and we can discuss them, of course, along with questions. And I want to thank you so much. This is where you can find me at zonegiggler.ca is my website. And of course, I'm a regular reporter on the Skeptic Zone, so make sure you check that out. And the bottom one is the Calgary. Just Google Tourette OCD Alberta Network. It's a very long www thing to copy down. If you Google Tourette OCD Alberta Network, there's a lot of really great information, including the papers written about the TikTok tics by Dr. Tamara Pringsheim and others. So if you ever want to check out more information, that's where you will get it. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the questions. I always love question and answer sessions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Adrienne. That was incredibly enlightening. And I definitely went for it with the tics, because I managed to crack my shoulder a couple of times.
For you. Well, Jewel watching over would be proud of you.
We're now going to have a quick break of about 15 minutes. So during that break, please visit sitp.online/ask, and that's where you can post your own questions for the Q&A session, or you can see questions submitted by other viewers and upvote any questions that you'd like to see asked. So that's a 15-minute break we're going to take, so we'll be back at 8:20 UK time for the Q&A. Thank you very much. Hi, and welcome back to the Q&A session for Skeptics in the Pub Online. So we're going to get stuck into some of the questions that you've been sending us over Slido, and we've got lots of excellent questions.
Really good
so
questions.
This should be a brilliant session. So we're going to start with a question from Serdar, who asks, how can we create a more comfortable environment for individuals with Tourette syndrome, especially in meetings or similar gatherings?
What a great question. And it's one that is often asked at schools when I go into schools, as well as community, like workplaces. How do we make everybody feel more comfortable? The best thing to do is ignore the text. Just ignore them. Don't say anything, because if you do say something, it's going to make them want to tick more. And, it's just best to ignore ticks and assume they're not doing it on purpose to annoy you. I think that's a really important part of it, because some of the problem is us making judgments about why somebody is doing something unusual. So when I would go into schools, I would say, if you see somebody in the mall doing something really unusual, doing unusual movements, or suddenly singing out loud, because there are singing ticks. I've actually had students, one who did rap, all of a sudden would just start rapping. And how did I deal with it? I started moving to it. And so the kids started thinking that was awesome, and they would start moving to it too. So we model that kind of acceptance. I had another student who actually would suddenly start doing opera in the classroom. And so because the kids knew, they would just ignore it. The other issue is, of course, if you know it's probably not purposeful, it becomes more of a background noise for us as well. So if you're going to, like, we hear people coughing and sneezing in public all the time. So if you hear somebody shout a swear word suddenly, you can maybe go like this, but then just like you would go like this if somebody, especially now, coughed after COVID, right? Don't you do that? You find you do that, but we don't say anything. So we treat Tourette syndrome exactly the same way. If they want to talk about it, that's fine. So if you get to know them and they tell you that it's Tourette syndrome, that's great. I actually, if you don't mind, can I tell a funny story?
Absolutely.
So I was in the theater, the ballet, and I was sitting beside somebody I'd never sat beside. We had seasons passes, but this person I'd never seen before. And the very first thing that happened when the ballet started is he shouted at the top of his lungs, very staccato, Asperger's. And then all of a sudden proceeded to elbow me. Me, a parent of kids with Tourette syndrome, was going, I think this might be Tourette syndrome. And, and so wasn't a judge. Could you imagine if I didn't know that? I'd be like, I might have said something, stop it, right? Which would have made it worse. It would have elevated it. After a couple hits in the elbow, there were no more. It just went away. And it just was non-existent. Now, if it had persisted, I think it would have been fine to just kind of quietly say, are you okay? But not stop that, because that will elevate. There's a reason that this is happening. And but I did talk to him at the break. I turned to him and said, because I was pretty confident, I'm not supposed to diagnose, but I said, excuse me, sir, but do you have Tourette syndrome? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, well, I have 2 kids with Tourette syndrome. And he went, oh, it was all good. We chatted a little bit. And then he came back. Second act started, Asperger's, but I didn't get a single hit. I think the anxiety had gone down. It was good. So the best thing you could do is really treat it kindly, as I say. Of course, you don't want to be hit all the time. That's unacceptable. He knows that's unacceptable. He doesn't want. That's my assumption. My assumption is he does not want to be doing this. And I was right. Based on our conversation, and he just relaxed once he knew I understood what was going on.
Yeah, which such an important thing about awareness, like, because if you know what it is, then you know how to respond.
Exactly.
And I'm sure, like, it must be a bit of a vicious cycle for a lot of people with Tourette syndrome if they're going out in public and worrying about ticking and worrying about how people are going to react.
Exactly.
Like, having people like learn to react appropriately will hopefully take some of that anxiety out of those experiences for the people who do have ticking conditions.
And it also helps for the person with Tourette syndrome to seek the proper treatment to help, especially with the embarrassing tics and the painful tics. So that I think there's some questions coming up about that. I'm kind of leading into that, but yeah, it's really important. And I think the biggest thing is just not be as judgmental. I think that's really, there is a reason probably for this happening. And most people do not want to be doing this stuff. That's my experience.
Yeah. So our next question comes from Neil, and they ask, a friend claims that a lot of kids or parents are faking this, Tourette's presumably, to excuse poor behaviour and or get extra help at schools. Is there any data to push back on this?
Not being the person who's actually researching this, off the top of my head, I can't say for sure that there's data or not. But from my experience and from what we teach, based on Dr. Tamara Pringsheim, Dr. David Martino, so many people, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., is that it's not that most of the time. Could it happen? Sure. And one of the tricky parts is that there can be what we call negative reinforcement. And I got caught doing this with my oldest, and one of the disorders he has is rage disorder. So he threw chairs at school. He would tear things apart. He never punched holes in walls, but I've known people who've had to patch walls because of the violent outbursts. And so my oldest had this. And so what I would do is I would say, okay, we had a keyword, and he'd go into his room and he'd lie down and I'd give him a foot rub. And then the psychologist said, yeah, you shouldn't be doing that. That's negative reinforcement. You're reinforcing that negative behavior. So you give him a foot rub when he's not doing that. Do you see the subtle difference? And so I changed that. And so it's really easy to actually get into that loop of actually encouraging it, even though you think you're doing the right thing. So can that happen? Absolutely, it can happen. But I don't think it's intentional. I certainly didn't do it intentionally. And most of the time, the kids do not want that extra help. It's embarrassing to them. My kids, and many that I have worked with over the years, were fine going off to the learning resource room for extra help and extra time because they needed it. Because quite often you probably found that when you wrote your empathy exercise, your writing got worse as you went, as you carried on. So dysgraphia is a huge issue with kids with Tourette syndrome, especially with the multiple disorders. So they would have to get extra help. And they're usually really excited about it when they're in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5. By grade 6, they're starting to say, I don't want to be pulled out of, I don't want to be noticed. Junior high, they don't want to do it at all quite often. Some do, some don't. So usually they're very embarrassed by the extra help. Are there exceptions? Sure. But I like to operate as a teacher as well as a parent, from the positive side and say they need help and let's see what we can do about it. And not, they're just doing it for attention, or they just want to get it, they just want to be seen this way, or they want whatever the motivation is. They don't make sense to me. And if you really think about it, negative attention is attention, I guess. And that's where that negative reinforcement comes in. You're reinforcing that negative behavior, and that's what needs to be stopped. And that's where the team comes together with the psychologists, the psychiatrists. Bottom line is, even if that's the case where it's become that, where they get the reinforcement from the negative behaviors, there's probably something that needs to be helped still. Doesn't mean they don't need help. They may just not be getting the right kind of help, right? That's it. So
if you're willing to go to extreme measures to get attention, there's probably something wrong.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. There's something wrong. It still need help. End of story. So don't deny it because you think it's attention seeking. Yeah. I hope I answered that okay.
Our next question is from Skeptical Gumby, and they ask, is there a common part of the brain that seems to be associated with TS, OCD, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Great question. And I have to go far back in my memory banks because I have read about this. And I remember a book I had, particularly for obsessive compulsive disorder, where they actually show the brain scans that light up with regards to the brain. I don't remember which part of the brain. ADHD, same thing. I have a wonderful video that shows the development of the prefrontal cortex and how much behind the regular kid it is via age. It's a wonderful thing, and I got that from Children's Hospital here in Calgary. So yes, I believe they have identified the parts of the brain that these disorders come from. I think with Tourette syndrome, it's kind of deep in the middle, and whereas ADHD is prefrontal, and I don't remember where OCD is, but it is somewhere. And I may be a little off on that because it's been a while since I've actually been asked that question. So good question.
Yeah, it's quite a tricky one trying to attach behaviors or disorders to specific regions of the brain.
Very difficult.
Especially because like a lot of these disorders are like very heterogeneous, like they present very differently in different people. And
yes.
So to then try and bring it back to, well, it's this specific bit of brain.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
At best, that'll be true on average.
Yeah, there's regions. It's not like, right there. And there's a lot of talk in the last few years about obsessive compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome. And it can be very difficult to parse out, is this an obsessive compulsive behavior or is it a tic? They're very similar. And there's even been some suggestions from some people that maybe they're really part of the same thing. It's really hard sometimes to parse it out.
Yeah. Our next question comes from Igor, and they ask, is the way to get a diagnosis purely symptomatical, or do we have some TS gland, TS gene, and TS part of the brain that we can poke around?
That's a great question, too. At this point in time, as far as I know, it is purely diagnostic based on what is observed and taking a history from parents, from teachers, etc. There is no blood test, there is no brain scan, there's nothing that they will do to diagnose Tourette syndrome. They just check a bunch of boxes and that's it. It's a great question.
Our next question is from Linda, and they ask, does the fact that it's more common in boys suggest an X chromosome association or cause?
Oh, that's fantastic. I would guess yes, but that's a total guess. Not being a doctor, it would be very hard for me to answer that one, but it's a great question and something that I think I will look into and maybe ask Dr. Pringsheim about. But it would seem like that, doesn't it? I mean, with the incidence so much greater in boys. And the other thing that may impact the answer to that I just thought of is there is some thought that with girls, they present differently and they tend to have more obsessive compulsive symptoms versus tics. So that's what people will focus on instead of the tics. So there may be a more equal balancing that would negate that. But as far as I know, they haven't found anything more about that. But I know there was talk about that a few years ago.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my follow-up question, was like how likely it is that there is a biological reason that it gets diagnosed more in boys than girls, or whether it's something about the difference in the ways that boys and girls are socialized. Because it's quite a common issue with ADHD.
I was just going to say.
Yeah, that it presents completely different in boys and girls. And part of that might be that when a boy is like climbing the curtains, it's like, oh, it's just Harry being Harry. Mm-hmm. Whereas girls from quite an early age, their behavior gets policed a lot more. And so they end up with much more internalized symptoms of ADHD.
And they quite often just have the attention part without the hyperactivity.
Sure.
It's very common. So if a girl has a hyperactive, you probably would see them just as much as the boys, because that one's just out there.
Yeah.
But I think that was discovered later, that there are a lot of girls who have this disorder. But again, it presents differently. It's not as physical. Is that environmental or is that ingrained? Don't know. I can't answer that one. But yeah, they are very different. They can be very different, but they can be very much the same as well. And you can have boys who don't have the hyperactive component. In fact, all three of my boys do not have the hyperactive component. So we're not diagnosed with ADHD until they were adults.
Yeah. So the next question comes from Nadia, and they ask, oh, could it be that girls are underdiagnosed, or that their tics are replaced with crying or less noticeable things that are more acceptable by society? Like,
Yeah,
can that happen with Tourette's? Like, do you have any sort of not conscious control of your tics, but is there a way that the tics can manifest in a way that is more socially acceptable?
Yeah, there's lots of examples of that. And that's actually one of the things that is given to kids as a tool as well as adults. There's a well-known teacher in the United States, and I don't know if he's still teaching, but he did teach in the early 2000s. And he was an elementary school teacher, and he had the F word tic at that time. Can you imagine being an elementary school teacher? So what he did is he changed it to duck. So he would say duck all the time, and he became known as the quacking teacher, which I thought was quite adorable. And it's kind of the same as scratching around your mosquito bite. So it kind of alleviates it, but not fully. So he's going to probably go home and be pretty exhausted at the end of the day for doing that. And that is something that is often found with kids before they're diagnosed. Is that they will suppress in school because they're so embarrassed, especially in that junior high time. And so I would not be surprised if it's worse with girls, because they seem to be hyper aware of everything around them and more aware of those perceptions than some boys. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. And it was extremely difficult for us to get a diagnosis for my oldest. We had him to specialists, and he had severe tics. And unfortunately, even the medical profession has this stereotypical idea of what Tourette looks like. So if they're not swearing, oh, it's not Tourette syndrome. It's not that. It's not that. And that's one of the things the Tourette OCD Alberta Network is really trying to do, is to train doctors of all kinds to recognize what this is. Even though my oldest had severe tics from the age of 5, mild ones at age of 4, he was not diagnosed until 11. And even when I went to the doctor and said, I think my kid may have Tourette syndrome, because I read an article in the Globe and Mail, our national newspaper, my doctor said, oh, I don't think so. That's a very serious diagnosis. No, but I'll send you to the Tourette clinic just in case. And we came out with Tourette Plus, right? Not just Tourette syndrome, but all this other stuff. So I was very grateful for that, because that helped with my other kids a lot. Once we got the diagnosis, we had a direction. And I learned that I was doing the best I could, but I was not doing a good job at parenting. And the first thing when I said to Graham, I said, well, we're not going to be doing this anymore, because I now recognize that this is something that's not helping you. And he said, I tried to tell you that, Mom. So, yeah, you did. But I knew better because I was the parent, but oh well.
Our next question comes from Monica, and they ask, differences between tics and autistic stims. They seem similar in terms of one can learn to suppress the urge, but it's uncomfortable and a high energy cost.
Yes, very similar. There's a lot of crossover between the autistic spectrum disorder and Tourette syndrome. In fact, one of the suggestions regarding my oldest son from the principal was that he was autistic. And I remember getting a checklist from Tourette Canada about autism and Tourette syndrome. And you check the boxes and they have both going down. And then the only one, and this is how the psychiatrist told me, so this is his words, and hopefully I remembered correctly, it's a long time ago, you know how the memory can be. And what he said, the main difference between Tourette syndrome and autistic spectrum disorder is that people with Tourette syndrome recognize social cues easily. And in autism spectrum disorder, that's something that is a struggle. And why they get mixed up often and misdiagnosed as autistic is because they're ticking and obsessing and hyperactive, hyper-focusing on things. They'll miss the social cues. But if they see them, they react correctly. So that's the big difference, is they'll miss a lot of cues because of what's going on in their poor brains. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to an extent. I'm just wondering about, so telling the difference between an autistic person who is stimming and an autistic person who also has Tourette's and is ticking. If there's
I think there is a difference between the stem and a tick, because I think the stem, if this is not my specialty, so this is based on just subtle things that I've learned over the years, is more repetitive, like this, right? Like the rocking. You're not going to get that with somebody with Tourette syndrome. You're going to get the, and then there's nothing.
Okay.
Or you might get, right? So it is different. But somebody with autism can definitely have tics. I've actually gone into schools where the student has been diagnosed with both, and you can see the difference between the tic, which is usually, the tics can be slow, so you can do a muscle tense and they can just do this and hold it. Same with the abdominal one, that's usually very slow, but that's not a stim. Do you see the difference? The stem is, I think I'm saying the wrong word, stem. The stim, there's more of a kind of a repetitive, if I'm correct. I may be wrong with that, but
yeah, I wonder if there's like a difference in, like, and this is just speculation. I do not have any qualifications in this area at all. But as I understand it, stims are a self-soothing behavior. And so being able to engage in it is actually soothing.
Correct. Yes.
Whereas I assume that's not the case with
it is sort of, because there is a sense of relief afterwards. So it's like, when you scratch it, I'm going to go back to my scratching the mosquito bite example. When you scratch it at first, it feels better. So it's exactly, you've scratched the itch. There is, but it's not a calming necessarily. It's a release, I think, is the best way to, it just feels better. That's the same with obsessive compulsive disorder. And that's why there's all this discussion around when you do the obsession, okay, I have to do this 3 times, or something terrible will happen. It's an anxiety disorder. So doing this relieves that anxiety. But now it's back. Okay, I'm better. No. Until they have to do it over and over and over again. And one of the differentiations usually between OCD with Tourette syndrome and OCD on its own is that, like what I said, you have to circle before I take a drink 3 times, for example. Otherwise, my mother will die. It's nonsensical. They know it's nonsensical, but it's hidden because they know it. They're embarrassed. So it's called the hidden disorder. Many times teachers have no idea why they're refusing to work. That happened to my kids. They were accused of refusing to work when actually they were sitting there obsessing, because it's hidden inside their brain. Between that and somebody with Tourette syndrome is, okay, I have to do this 3 times. Then I can drink. Okay, I did the 3 times. It feels better. It's the same feeling as the tic, so that it reduces the anxiety around the feeling, that urge, that wanting to scratch it. Yeah. And so versus they usually don't have the crazy, no, I shouldn't say crazy, the irrational thoughts that often accompany true obsessive compulsive disorder. Yeah. Hope that helps. It's a tough one. Great question.
Yeah, and to some extent, you can't help wonder how important it is to differentiate these things. Like, I think the only good reason to do so is if these different things need different treatments.
Exactly. And that was where my psychiatrist was. He said, you know what, your kids are not clinically OCD, but I'm going to put that down on the little form, because then I know they'll get help in the classroom. Right. And so, because we still, it's just a little bit less, it's just not quite as severe, but it's still debilitating. It was debilitating to my kids. But when they hit puberty, they hit a wall, and then they needed medication. And even though it wasn't full-blown OCD, the treatment was the same. So you're right. It's semantics. It's the same thing. We're going to do the same treatment. So you may as well call it OCD, because, they've hit a wall, can't go to school. Therefore, they need help beyond the therapy. It's just, it's just too hard for them. So, and none of them, what's really interesting is my youngest and oldest who hit puberty, and it was just so devastating for them and us and teachers and everything. And they did have obsessive compulsive medication. And for my oldest, it was stuff that would help him not rage. And my youngest was anxiety medications, which is OCD. And that neither of them are on those anymore. Like, they got through puberty, that's it. And with the help of the strategies on top of that, it helped them move on and get better. And one of the problems with OCD is if you don't do that, it can slowly and progressively get worse and worse and worse and out of control. It's not always, but it can. Yeah.
Our next question has been sent in anonymously. They ask, do you know how many people with Tourette syndrome also have autism spectrum conditions? I have both. I thought more autistic people had Tourette syndrome than the general population.
That's good question. I used to know that number, and I did not include that, and I couldn't pull it out of my head right now, but it is a great question. And because it's, I might be able to pull up a slide quickly, but there is a slide that Dr. Pringsheim, that I got out of the textbook, that sort of shows the progressive as to where everything comes on a timeline, and it has a lot of different disorders and when they actually hit and when they combine, etc. And I'm trying to think of what that was. But based on the fact that Tourette syndrome, the most common two are OCD and ADHD, I don't think autism spectrum disorder is up in that top number. What's an interesting question is, do most people with autism spectrum disorder also have Tourette syndrome?
Right.
And it could be. And I can't answer that. That's not my area of expertise. But that would be really interesting to look into if most do. I don't know that.
Our next question comes from Igor. And they ask, is comorbidity with Tourette syndrome go both ways? Can tics be used as a tool to help diagnose ADHD, for example?
And that's another really good question. Typically, the diagnostic order happens because ADHD is very recognized by doctors and teachers, especially the hyperactive. The quiet one, not so much, but the hyperactive. So what happens often is kids will get diagnosed with ADHD first, then they start ticking, and then they go, we've got this happening. And for a while, they actually thought that the Ritalin, the medications for ADHD were causing Tourette syndrome. But over time and looking at it and studying it, they learned that it just happens that the ADHD comes first. It goes along. Then by the time they get the diagnosis, they put them on the medications. And if they hadn't put them on the medication, they would have gotten the tics anyway. Because it's very easy to see what happens. They take them off the medications and the tics are still there. Yeah. So they're pretty sure now that it's not that. However, because of the prevalence of ADHD with Tourette syndrome and OCD with Tourette syndrome, if you come in for the tics first, they're going to ask those questions for sure. They're going to look into, is there evidence of ADHD? Is there evidence of OCD? Because they know that there is quite often a comorbidity that goes along. So yes, it could help with that diagnosis, just having the tics. Depends on the order. But usually it's the ADHD that gets diagnosed first.
Right.
From my understanding, from talking to the doctors.
Okay. Our next question is also anonymous. And they ask, is there a genetic aspect to two of your children having Tourette's?
Yes. And they do say that they believe it's highly neurological. Or genetic, not obviously neurological, but it's highly genetic. And I remember going to a workshop by this incredible man named Dr. Duncan McKinley, who is a PhD psychologist who happens to have Tourette OCD, the whole gamut, that whole flowery thing, he had it all. And one of the best speakers I've ever seen. And I remember him when I went to talk to him, he says, okay, this is a dominant recessive gene, so you can stop blaming your spouse. It comes from both sides. So I've taken that advice. I stopped blaming my spouse. So yes, is there Tourette syndrome that is visible on each side? Actually, no. I think my dad has some tics that he hides. He's sort of indicated that, but he's never actually said much. There is obsessive compulsive disorder on both sides of our families, on my husband's and my side. Definitely ADHD in my family and on my husband's family as well. Just so you might have to just go back a ways to get the Tourette syndrome, but it's really common. And when they do the intake, they ask you, is this on what kind of things? They'll ask you questions. Is there signs of this or that? And they'll ask specific questions, and you either say yes or no. And so, yeah, there's stuff that's happening on both sides, and there probably was Tourette syndrome on both sides. Who knows how far back? So there you go. But I should answer as well. There are cases sometimes where it just happens, and it's really hard to trace, but it could go back farther, and there just happens to not be all this other stuff going on. I think somebody asked something about bacteria, because this is kind of relevant. There was something going around for a long time about something called pandas, and I forgot what that stands for. But essentially, if a kid got strep throat, they found that there were kids after strep that would develop Tourette syndrome. So they thought for a while that this bacterial infection could actually trigger Tourette syndrome. And I think that has largely been downplayed. I won't say it's debunked, because I think they're still thinking there might be something there, but they're not sure. But they don't really think it's as big a deal as what they originally thought. Like that there isn't really that correlational, there might be something else going on with it.
Yeah, I suppose the thing that immediately springs to mind for me with that is that what age is strep throat most common in kids? And so
exactly.
like maybe just time-wise it's coinciding. Yeah. There's no causal relationship there. It's just 7-year-olds get tonsillitis.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of what they found, but there's a couple cases that are a little more complicated, that they think, well, maybe. But from the research that I've looked at in my big book, my big green book that I have from the experts, they basically said highly unlikely.
Right.
Just for the same reasons you said, which is great.
Our next question is submitted anonymously, and they ask, can cognitive behavioural therapy help with Tourette's, and is it the first line of treatment for OCD? Is it the first line of treatment for OCD? Yes. Is cognitive behavioural therapy the first line of treatment for OCD?
Excellent question again. Yes, the cognitive behavioral intervention for tics is essentially cognitive behavioral therapy that's been tweaked enough to help with tics. But what they actually have found now is that the best intervention for tics and getting rid of dangerous and harmful tics, like self-harming, the ones where we talked in the break about hitting yourself. My friend Steve Call actually has that tic. So if he's holding a fork, he quickly puts a pillow up. He always has a pillow with him because he'll damage himself. So those kinds of tics are really good to try and get rid of. And so it's more of an exposure and response type therapy now that they're really kind of going towards, versus the cognitive behavioral component. However, that's still part of it, because I think it's an important part, sort of reframing how you look at things. But exposure and response, if you're not really sure what that is, I actually went through that because the psychologist turned to me knowing, if the kids are having issues, mom probably has some issues too, turned to me and said, what things are you going to overcome to support your kids? And there were two things. One was fear of heights, and one was public speaking. Here I am. And so how do we overcome heights? You go to high places and you talk. You face your worst fear. So as I'm driving to the Calgary Tower, which has a glass floor on the bottom, I'm thinking I'm going to die. The glass is going to break. It's very counterintuitive. So this is the type of therapy that they're really tending to use now for tics. And to give you an example, this goes back quite a ways. My youngest, Emily, she had this tic that was like this. Looks really boring, right? Not very serious. She did it so much that her whole arm started to hurt. And so I went to the psychologist, explained what was going on, and he said, okay, we're going to do some exposure and response with this. And this is before CBIT and all these things. He was just kind of going, well, we're going to give it a try. Let's see how it goes. He taped his hand up, her hand up, and I had to be the bad guy and say, you're going to feel terrible that you can't move your thumb. It's going to be like an itch you can't scratch, and you're going to feel anxious, and it's going to be painful just to hold it still. And he got to do the really nice stuff and say, Emily, you're doing a great job. You're doing so well with this, and just take some deep breaths. So he got to do the nice things for Emily. I got to do the nasty talk. And part of exposure and response is you never do something the person can't handle. So you only do as much. You don't push them to the edge to the point where they're screaming and having a fit and a meltdown, because then it's going to be nasty already. The anxiety level is going to go up before it comes down. And so we kept asking, are you okay? Can you keep it on? How long do you think you can keep this tape on? Eventually, we left with this on. She left it on for the rest of the day, took it off, tick was gone. So it can be that quick, but it's hard work. That was a hard day for Emily that day. It was tough. So that's what I mean by exposure and response. And they're moving more towards that being the most effective treatment to get rid of harmful and painful tics now. And cognitive behavioral therapy is huge with OCD, and it is the front line. Cognitive behavioral and exposure and response, that's just my bias, I think because that was my psychologist's bias. He would jump right in, if you were willing and able, jump right into the exposure and response, but not everybody can do that. So the cognitive behavioral therapy component is still very important. And so blend those two together. Yeah. They're very important.
Presumably the exposure and response for tics is, there'll be some tics that's just not really, there's no practical way of doing that.
I'm not sure what, say that again?
With the exposure and response therapy for tics, like there must be some that's just not an option.
Oh, I see.
Maybe for certain vocal tics, I'd imagine. Would be the exposure, like using that tube.
Yeah, if it's going to be something coming out, and this is very common with the CBIT, is it's coming out. So you have your water bottle. Most people have a water bottle with them. Every time you feel like you're going to say the tic, because there is a premonitory urge most of the time, not always, but most of the time, they take a drink instead. So it goes in. So it's the exact opposite. And you imagine while you're doing it, I really want to do this and I'm going to feel terrible. So there's that thought process. It's very counterintuitive. And then you congratulate. A big component to exposure and response is sort of that reward afterwards. So you congratulate yourself. You after this talk, for example, I should go have a glass of wine and revel in the moment that I got through. I mean, I don't need to do that anymore. But when I first was doing public speaking, oh my goodness, I thought I was going to die. Which is dumb, right? I'm a teacher. People would say to me, what are you talking about? You're a teacher. Get out of my classroom. And I was not good. So so it's that same idea. So you can actually help almost all tics that way. I think you just have to be creative. And I think it can be difficult, but that's how they fixed the vomiting tic. Is every time he started to cough, because we had that cue that he was going to cough, he had a handful of cough drops in his pocket, and he would pop one in, and that seemed to do the trick. So you have to find what works, what will stop it, what will interrupt that normal body thing that's going to happen. So it might have been a drink of water, but in his case, it turned out he just had cough candies that he just popped in his mouth every time he coughed. And he had to really focus on not vomiting and keeping things in. And it took, I'm going to say 4 or 5 days, maybe 2 weeks most, for that tic to be taken away. That was a hard one. That was tough, right? That was really, he missed a lot of school, obviously. Yeah.
Our next question is from Serdar, and they ask, what is the most cruel pseudoscientific scam claiming to treat or prevent Tourette syndrome?
Ooh, that's tough. Well, my least favorite right now probably just is that muzzle. I just hate that thing. But I will say that there was a study that claimed that a chiropractor could cure ticks. So there's that double whammy. The chiropractor one is just so dangerous, right? That cracking. Yeah, I find that really, really hard. And this is one that appeared in the chapter of my big green book by Dr. Davida Martino. And it described how this study came out curing Tourette syndrome. But then they dive into it like, good people should do, look at the study, try and guess what the number of participants was for this study.
Was it one?
It was one. An N of one. And remember what I said about as you grow older, can go away. So I think this is another example. But what do they do? Oh, well, there's this study. And yeah, come see me. I'll fix your Tourette syndrome. It's money. It can be dangerous. You're talking about young kids. So I probably think that one horrifies me quite a lot.
Yeah. Our next question is from Igor. And they ask, is it better for a person with Tourette syndrome to announce their syndrome in advance so people they're talking to are prepared, or might that exacerbate the symptoms?
Great question again. And one of the strategies we have for kids who have the really out there tics, or adults, I know of adults that do this as well. So these are the kids who swear or say things out loud really loudly, or have really crazy movements and might accidentally hit somebody on a train, etc. They have little cards that they will just hand out to say, I'm sorry, I have Tourette syndrome and I didn't mean to hit you, or whatever it is that the issue is, just so that you understand. And if you have any questions, ask me. So, but not everybody is okay with that. Some people just want to keep it hidden. And I think this is my personal opinion, and I think there's evidence of this as well, that people who do that struggle more because the energy required to hold it in and to hide it is not insignificant. And I actually have a story because my oldest, when he first got the diagnosis, he got the diagnosis at 11, and he didn't tell his teachers because he didn't want to, and I respected that. We have to respect that. We didn't tell the teachers until he was 13, and I think it was 13, 12 or 13. It was well after. And the reason that happened is he is a really great public speaker, and he really loves doing projects. In the school he was at, they did what they called this investigative projects, that they could pick any topic that they wanted, and then they had to present it. And so he had a topic he loved and was ready to present, and he came home in tears after presenting because his teacher had marked him down on his presentation and content because of his throat clearing. And at that time, he had a throat clearing tic. When you have a throat clearing tic and you're anxious, you're going to throat clear a lot. She misunderstood that as being unprepared.
Okay.
And not that I would do that, but whatever. I have to think, in those days, this is again that assuming it's behavioral because of some reason. You're doing it for attention, you're unprepared, whatever, you're lazy. That was another one I got a lot about my kids and about other kids. And so I said to Graham, well, do you think your teacher would have marked you down if you told her that you have Tourette syndrome and that this is your tic right now? And he went, no, I don't think she would have marked me down because she's a nice lady. And so I said, do you want to change your mind? Would you like to talk to the teachers? And he said, yes. We talked she felt terrible. She felt awful. It was a good lesson for her not to prejudge and to assume, right? So it was, I think, a good learning moment for both of them. But that just illustrates, I think, how trying to hide it can really be detrimental to these kids. So we really try to tell them, when you're ready, let's tell the world.
Yeah.
And it's balancing that when you're ready. And you have to be kind, because you can totally understand why people don't want to share that information. It really is none of anybody's business.
Yeah.
But it can really reduce issues if you tell people. It builds understanding.
Yeah, that seems like such a wild assumption that the teacher made, though. Like that, like if I heard somebody clearing their throat a lot, I'd assume that they had a sore throat.
I like you. And that's a much more generous interpretation. And I think there is a little bit of a culture in teaching of assuming that sometimes kids can be lazy. They can, and there are. I mean, come on, we have to admit there are some kids who will do lots of things to avoid homework. But at the same time, as a teacher who didn't make those assumptions for many, many years, I had a lot of success with my students. And I think that's part of it, because you're not judging them negatively and you're giving them a chance. There's a great quote, and I can't remember the guy's name right now because ADHD, I'll blame it on that. And he wrote this book about dealing with rage disorder. And he said, Ross Green, I think is his name, Dr. Ross Green. And he wrote, kids will do well if they can. And if they can't, we need to help them. And I love that. I think it's true. I think it's, for most kids, I think there's always got to be the exception, but for most kids, and I found in my teaching career, I can't name one kid that wouldn't be true for.
Yeah. Yeah, I personally started coming to the conclusion that very few people are genuinely lazy.
Yeah.
Like, avoiding something isn't necessarily not wanting to do it. It can be anxiety or fear or I think
there's
it's one
usually
thing I feel like I learned through the pandemic, like the amount of people that started taking up several different hobbies. Like, a lot of people aren't very good at being lazy.
No, that's right. And I think that whole idea of they're being lazy and not just blaming them, like you said, but saying, okay, there must be a reason. There's something that is making sitting on the couch more appealing than getting up and going to the bathroom or getting up and doing the dishes. There's something happening to make that more appealing. And what has to happen is you switch that around to make it more appealing to go do the dishes. And how do you do that? And it can be really tricky, but it can be done. And I've seen it done with my kids. I mean, the professionals that I worked with were pretty amazing. Turned my parenting upside down, I'll tell you. Doing things that were totally counterintuitive. I could tell you stories.
Personally, I find the trick to doing dishes is a good podcast. It's a little treat then.
Agree. I agree. It really makes you do it. Same with I actually look forward, let's go for a walk with the dog, right? Because I can listen to the podcast, plus I'm outside, plus I got the dog. I mean, it's just a win-win-win, right? It's way better than sitting on the couch and listening to a podcast.
Unless there's a cat on you.
Oh, that sounds lovely. Yes, there we tip the balance back to lying on the couch, right?
Yeah. Our next question is from Eagle, and they ask, when a person has a verbal tic, is that an urge to say the word or an urge to say the word and be heard saying it?
Oh, wow. I would say no to the next one, because most of the time I could see a situation where that would be beneficial, because you're in a crowd and you're trying to get their attention and you want people to pay attention as a teacher, right? If they're a teacher, yeah, it would be real helpful. But if I think of my kids and all the kids that I've worked with over the years, I can't think of one that wanted the attention. Not a single one. I can't, it might exist. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but it is an irresistible urge that they choose to fulfill because it's hard not to, essentially, right? Just as I say, blinking, we can hold off our eyes blinking for quite a long time, but eventually you have to blink. And the range of words and noises is really astounding. It's such an interesting thing. My son made up a word, doidle, and this is before diagnosis, so we would get mad at him. And we would introduce him, this is our son Graham, and he'd go, doidle, hi, how are you? So we'd introduce, Graham, that's rude. You don't say that, you say hello. So we're trying to coach him on not doing this. He didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
He wanted to please his parents, but he couldn't not. So I can't think, you could always uncharitably believe that, I guess, but I think it would be uncharitable. That's my viewpoint. I hope that makes sense, Igor. We've had some good questions. I really like your questions.
Igor is frequently the champion of questions. We're going to have our final question now. And this one comes from Neil. And they ask, a friend claimed that they could get sufferers to control based enforcing better behaviour. And that might be by enforcing better behaviour. What's a good pushback on this? Tonight's talk, obviously, but...
Yeah, so I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you kind of try and rephrase that?
Yeah,
Is it...
I think that a friend claimed that they could get sufferers to control possibly their tics by enforcing better behaviour.
Oh.
And is there a good pushback on this?
I would say that, yes, you can sort of reward them not ticking. They can do it. But my pushback for that, especially if they're young, depends on the age, of course, even for adults. But young kids particularly, there's a tremendous cost that they may not be seeing. Because if they're not ticking, they are concentrating on not ticking. They're not concentrating on what the teacher is saying. They're not concentrating on what the parents want them to do. It will be exhausting. So they may not be able to do homework as well. They may not be able to perform as well at whatever sports they're doing. They may not be able to do music as well. There is a cost, and that has been studied a lot. So yeah, it may appear like they're doing better without their tics. It's better in the parents' mind because the kid's not ticking. So they see that as a behavior issue. But asking them to not do that when it's not really interfering with their life at home or in the theater. I've given examples where it may not be appropriate, or harmful to themselves or others. I don't think that approach is really going to be beneficial in the long run for the kids. And it could be setting them up for failure as well, especially young kids, because they find it so difficult. They may have better success with a 17-year-old, for example, because they're more able to control it. But there's still going to be that cost. And if they have the proper therapies, eventually that's what you want, that diminished number of tics, the diminished severity. There is some pretty good stuff coming out with exposure and response with the tics, the CBIT, if you use the exposure and response, that they do diminish the number and frequency of tics. And they're starting to get kids as young as possible to start. But it's not something that they're expected to do all the time. They might practice it for half an hour a day, but not their whole day. That would be really tiring for them.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
With a lot of things like ADHD, autism, and Tourette's, sometimes the focus that people have is like, how can I stop this other person's behavior bothering me?
Mm-hmm.
When if you take the approach of like, okay, well, what can we do to improve this individual's quality of life? Mm-hmm. There's a good chance you'll end up with different solutions to the same problem.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that, remember, I mentioned Duncan McKinley when he was talking about it's a dominant recessive gene, and he was talking. One of the things he said that he sees all the time in classrooms, and I've certainly seen this as well, is the kid. I'm going to use my kid as an example with the throwing chairs. It could be any behavior, right? It could be whatever. Okay, throw chairs, punish. Then he throws chairs. Then he punishes. You punish. You throw chairs. You punish. And okay, we've done this 3 times, and the behavior's not changing. You need to come over here and now rethink this and come up with something that will work, because that's not working. And why are we doing the same thing over and over? And that tends to be in traditional models. We punish, we punish, we punish, and the behavior doesn't change. And with my son, we thought, okay, what is happening here? And we need to redirect the behavior. And this is a classic thing with ADHD as well, redirect the behavior to more positive things. So it's not acceptable to throw chairs. You could hurt somebody, you could damage things, you could hurt yourself. You just can't do that. End of story, you can't do that. And so we did punish, as in he had to stay after school for a week putting the chairs up properly, which he agreed was an appropriate punishment. And we came up with possible solutions, and this is where that discussion happens with kids. What do you think will work? And the clinic recommended, well, tell him if he's starting to feel this bubbling over to run outside, because if you're running, you're not going to destroy anything. I'm not a runner. I hate running. I won't do that. Okay, well, that's not going to work. We finally settled on tearing up paper. So they had a stack of paper on his desk and at the back of the classroom, that if he started feeling terrible, he would grab the paper, and he decided he would want to go outside to do this because he didn't want to do it in front of his peers. He was embarrassed, and he would run outside if he could. Sometimes it would just explode, and so he would do it in front of his peers. But most of the time, he was able to run outside, and then he would tear up the paper. Sometimes it would turn out to be a test. Teachers were great, though. They go, okay, you can redo it, whatever. You have a bad day. And in university, because as he got older, those rage episodes really went down. And when he went to university, they had boxes of Kleenex. By then, he liked Kleenex to tear up. And so they would know. He would come in, we got to get Graham a room. And he would tear up the Kleenex, but then he'd have to buy a new box of Kleenex, and he'd have to clean it up once he calmed down. All right? So he has to be still responsible for his behaviors. So it's that reframing into a more positive direction and enabling success. You have to guarantee success, otherwise it's not going to work. And guarantee success at a short step. If you say, by the end of 2 years from now, you have to be able to do this, fine, but okay, let's break this up and do, by tomorrow, this is how it's going to be, and it'll be a little baby step, if that makes sense. Okay, so hope that answers that question. But yeah, I think there's a huge cost if you go that route, to be honest. And especially because kids want to please, so they're going to try their best. Some of them will act out, and then it becomes that the behavior disorder, the oppositional behavior disorder can quickly happen.
Okay, well, I'm pretty sorry to say we're going to have to stop it there. I could very happily keep you chatting all night.
I would be very happy.
Well, as we always do after our talks, we're going to open our virtual pub, the Lock-Ins Razor, which you're more than welcome to join. And I hope many members of the audience will also come along and have their choice of drinks in our virtual pub.
Oh, that's exciting. Well, thank you so much, Kat, and everybody else, the Batty and Cleo and Igor. Thank you so much. It was really fun and is so close to my heart. I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Lovely. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you very much to the audience as well. Our next talk will be from Dr. Christopher Labos. And he's going to talk to us about on how cholesterol science became pseudoscience. And that's going to be here on Twitch, starting at 7 o'clock UK time on the 28th of March. And if you'd like to stay up to date with our future events, keep an eye on our website, which is sitp.online, or you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Or if you'd like to keep in touch with other skeptics all around the world, you can join our Discord and you can chat with them any day you like. But that's it for this month, and hopefully see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.